My landlord, Vincent, crammed 43 people into our 12-person building by converting storage units into windowless apartments until a fire almost culled my daughter because he'd removed all the smoke detectors to install more illegal rooms. Then, when I gathered evidence, he started stalking my 8-year-old at school and threatening to report my undocumented neighbors to ICE. But I'd been recording everything, including his confession about taking out insurance policies before the suspicious electrical fires started. My landlord Vincent had been running an illegal subletting scheme in our apartment building for 3 years, cramming desperate tenants into dangerous conditions while collecting triple rent. But I only discovered the full extent after the fire that almost culled my daughter. It started when I noticed strange faces in the hallways at odd hours, people I'd never seen before carrying mattresses up the back stairs at 2 a.m., multiple families cooking in the communal kitchen meant for 6 units, and Vincent always had excuses about temporary guests or maintenance workers staying overnight. The building was supposed to house 12 tenants across 6 apartments, but I started counting and realized there were at least 40 people living there, some in windowless basement storage units, others in the illegally converted attic where Vincent had run extension cords and garden hoses for makeshift utilities. I tried calling the city, but Vincent's brother worked in the housing department, and my complaints mysteriously vanished, while Vincent started making my life hell with fake lease violations, shutting off my hot water for repairs that never happened, and telling other tenants I was a snitch who wanted to get them evicted. Things escalated when I found families with children living in what used to be the boiler room. No windows, no proper ventilation, just a space heater plugged into a daisy chain of power strips. And when I confronted Vincent, he smiled and said if I kept causing problems, he'd evict me for the made-up lease violations he'd been documenting. He showed me photos he'd taken of my apartment during inspections when I wasn't home, items moved to make it look like I had unauthorized pets, damage to walls that he'd caused himself, even planted substance paraphernalia that he'd photographed and removed, building a case that would destroy my reputation and make it impossible to rent anywhere else. I started documenting everything with hidden cameras, recording the foot traffic, the illegal construction, the cash payments that never generated receipts, and most damning, the conversation where Vincent bragged to another landlord about his foolproof system for extracting maximum profit from desperate immigrants who couldn't complain. The turning point came at 3 a.m. when smoke filled our hallway because one of those daisy-chained power strips in the basement had sparked, and as I ran through the building banging on doors, I realized Vincent had removed the smoke detectors to install more illegal rooms, and the fire exits were blocked with beds and furniture. My daughter was coughing so hard she couldn't breathe as we evacuated 43 people from a building certified for 12, including an elderly couple trapped in a windowless room who would have died if another tenant hadn't broken down their door, while Vincent showed up and tried to prevent anyone from calling 911. The fire department condemned the building immediately, but Vincent had the audacity to demand we all continue paying rent for our dangerous negligence in causing the fire, threatening to sue us and report undocumented tenants to ICE if anyone cooperated with investigators. That's when I unveiled my months of evidence to the district attorney, not just about our building, but the 7 others Vincent owned, all running the same scheme, generating over $400,000 per year in illegal rent while maintaining the properties in deadly conditions. The raid on his properties happened simultaneously across the city, revealing over 300 people living in conditions that violated every housing code imaginable, including one building where he'd converted an old walk-in freezer into a studio apartment with no heat or windows. Vincent was arrested on charges ranging from racketeering to endangerment, but at his bail hearing he kept smiling at me, and his lawyer mentioned they had concerns about the authenticity of certain evidence and would be investigating how I'd obtained my recordings. 2 weeks later, I came home to find my apartment door slightly open and my computer missing along with all my backup drives, but I'd anticipated this and had copies stored in 3 different locations, including one with a journalist who was preparing an expose on citywide housing corruption. The trial was supposed to start next month, but Vincent's brother in the housing department has been promoted to oversee inspection reforms, and 3 witnesses have suddenly decided to move back to their home countries after receiving visits from men asking questions about their immigration status. Last night, I got a text from an unknown number with a photo of my daughter's school and the message, "Nice building, shame if something happened to it." And when I tried to trace the number, it led back to a company called VR Property Solutions, which doesn't exist on any official registry, but somehow just purchased the building next to my daughter's school for renovation, and I think I know exactly what kind of renovations they have in mind. I stared at my phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the photos Vincent's people had sent. Not just my daughter's school, but pictures of her walking to class, eating lunch with friends, even one taken through the classroom window during math. My stomach churned as I realized they'd been watching her for days, documenting her routine, learning her schedule. I forwarded everything to the journalist and my lawyer, then called the school to warn them about suspicious individuals, but the secretary brushed off my concerns, explaining that construction crews had been surveying the area all week for the new building renovation. The renovation, VR Property Solutions, Vincent's phantom company preparing to turn another building into a death trap, right next to where my daughter spent 8 hours a day. I drove to the school immediately, circling the block to see the property myself. Sure enough, there were permits posted for residential conversion, and men in hard hats measuring doorways, marking walls, running calculations that I knew meant they were figuring out how many desperate people they could cram into each room. One of them looked familiar, and when he turned, I recognized him from Vincent's other properties, the same foreman who'd installed those illegal basement units where the elderly couple had nearly died. I parked across the street and started taking pictures, documenting the workers, the permit numbers, the company vehicles with magnetic signs that could easily be removed. Through my camera lens, I watched them unload the same cheap materials Vincent always used, the thin drywall that wouldn't muffle sound, the substandard wiring that would overload within months, the narrow doors that would trap people if another fire broke out. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number showing a picture of me sitting in my car at that exact moment. screenshot taken from somewhere behind me. The message read, "Still watching, still documenting, just like you." My hands shook as I started the engine and drove away, checking my mirrors constantly for anyone following. At a red light, I noticed a van 2 cars back that had been behind me since the school. So I took 4 right turns in a row, and sure enough, the van stayed with me through the pointless circle. Instead of going home, I drove to the police station and parked right in front, watching as the van slowed, hesitated, then continued past. I spent an hour inside filing a report about the stalking and surveillance, but the desk sergeant seemed more interested in whether I had any history of mental health issues or previous conflicts with neighbors than in the evidence I was showing him. Back home, I found my mailbox stuffed with official-looking documents, eviction notices citing lease violations I'd never committed, photos of supposed damage to my apartment that had been digitally altered, even a letter from a law firm threatening to sue me for defamation and tortious interference with business relations. The kicker was a notice from Child Protective Services saying they'd received an anonymous report about unsafe living conditions and would be conducting a home visit within 72 hours. Vincent wasn't just trying to silence me anymore. He was systematically destroying my life using every bureaucratic weapon at his disposal. I called my lawyer, but his secretary said he was in court. I called the journalist, but got voicemail. I called 3 other attorneys, but they all said they couldn't take a case against Vincent, mumbling about conflicts of interest or full caseloads. The isolation was deliberate, I realized. Vincent and his brother had connections everywhere, favors owed, palms greased, a network of corruption that made fighting back feel like punching smoke. But I still had the evidence, and more importantly, I had the other tenants who'd survived that night, witnesses who'd seen everything firsthand. I started making calls to the families who'd escaped the fire, but the first 3 numbers were disconnected. The 4th person answered, but immediately hung up when I said my name. The 5th, a young mother named Maria, who'd been living in the basement with her 2 kids, whispered that men had come to her new apartment asking questions, suggesting that her immigration status might be reviewed if she testified. She was terrified, and I couldn't blame her. Vincent wasn't just threatening legal action. He was weaponizing people's fears, their vulnerability, their desperate need to stay in this country and keep their families together. That evening, I sat with my daughter doing homework, trying to act normal while my mind raced through contingencies. She could tell something was wrong, kept asking why I was checking the windows, why I'd installed new locks, why her uncle was suddenly picking her up from school instead of letting her walk home with friends. I made up excuses about being extra careful, but kids aren't stupid. There's something oddly convenient about how Vincent's brother just happens to work in the housing department where complaints disappear. Makes me wonder how long this arrangement has been protecting him while 43 people lived in a building meant for 12. She knew we were in danger, even if she didn't understand the full scope of what Vincent was capable of. The next morning, I woke to find my car tires slashed and a note under the windshield. Next time, it won't be the tires. I called the police again, but they said without video evidence they couldn't prove who did it. The security camera on our building that would have captured the vandalism had mysteriously malfunctioned overnight, the footage corrupted beyond recovery. I was starting to understand how Vincent had operated for so long without consequences. It wasn't just corruption, it was a systematic approach to intimidation that stayed just within the boundaries of plausible deniability. I replaced the tires and drove to meet the journalist at a coffee shop downtown, constantly checking for surveillance. She'd been digging into Vincent's background and discovered his network extended beyond housing. He had connections to construction companies that cut corners, inspection services that looked the other way, even a cousin who worked in immigration enforcement. The web of corruption was vast, but also fragile, she explained. If we could expose one thread, the whole thing might unravel. But we needed more than my evidence. We needed someone on the inside to flip. That's when I remembered Carlos, the maintenance worker at Vincent's properties who'd helped evacuate people during the fire. He'd seemed conflicted that night, torn between his job and his conscience as he watched families stumble out of smoke-filled rooms. I'd seen him arguing with Vincent afterward, gesturing at the blocked exits and disabled smoke detectors. If anyone might be willing to talk, it would be him. But finding Carlos would mean going back to Vincent's properties, walking right into the lion's den. I spent the afternoon preparing, uploading all my evidence to multiple cloud services, sending encrypted copies to contacts in other cities, even mailing a USB drive to my sister in another state with instructions to release everything if something happened to me. Paranoid? Maybe. But I'd learned that Vincent's reach was longer than I'd imagined, and I needed insurance beyond what any official system could provide. The journalist gave me a small recording device disguised as a pen, and we agreed on a check-in schedule. If I missed a call, she'd assume the worst and publish everything. That night, I drove past 3 of Vincent's buildings, looking for Carlos's truck. At the 4th property, I spotted it parked outside, and through the lobby window, I could see him replacing a light fixture. I waited until he came out for a smoke break, then approached carefully, making sure we were alone. His face went pale when he saw me, and he immediately started walking away, but I called out that I just wanted to talk, that I knew he'd tried to do the right thing during the fire. He stopped, but didn't turn around, his shoulders tense as he said Vincent had eyes everywhere, that talking to me was dangerous. I told him about the school next to my daughter's, about VR property solutions, about how Vincent was planning to expand his operation. Carlos's hands clenched into fists as he muttered that he'd seen the plans. Dozens more illegal units, families with kids crammed into spaces without proper exits. He had a daughter too, he said, and the thought of children burning because of greed made him sick. But Vincent paid well, and jobs were hard to find with his record. I asked what kind of record, and Carlos admitted he'd done time for a mistake in his youth. Nothing violent, but enough to make employers nervous. Vincent hired ex-cons because he knew they'd be grateful and quiet, less likely to complain about what they saw. But the fire had changed things. Carlos couldn't sleep anymore, kept seeing that elderly couple's faces, kept imagining his own daughter trapped in a room with no windows. He wanted out, but didn't know how to leave without Vincent making his life hell. We talked for 20 minutes in the shadows between buildings, Carlos chain-smoking as he described the extent of Vincent's operation. The cash payments, the off-the-books contractors, the way Vincent would target recent immigrants who didn't know their rights. He told me about a storage unit where Vincent Vincent kept duplicate books, the real records of his income, not the sanitized versions he showed to tax authorities. Carlos had a key, had been asked to retrieve files from there before. If we could get those records, we'd have proof of tax evasion on top of everything else. Before we parted, Carlos agreed to think about cooperating, but he needed guarantees, protection for his family, help finding new work, assurance that he wouldn't face charges for his minor role in Vincent's schemes. I promised to talk to the district attorney to see what kind of deal might be possible. As I walked back to my car, I felt a mixture of hope and dread. We were building a case, but Vincent was escalating too, and I worried about what he might do when cornered. The home visit from Child Protective Services was scheduled for the next morning, and I spent the night cleaning obsessively, organizing documents that proved I was a fit parent, trying to anticipate what false allegations Vincent might have made. My daughter helped, confused but cooperative, arranging her room and homework to show she was well cared for. The irony wasn't lost on me that Vincent, who'd endangered dozens of children with his greed, was now trying to use child welfare services as a weapon against me. When the social worker arrived, she seemed surprised by the normal, clean apartment and the healthy, well-adjusted child who answered her questions politely. She went through her checklist professionally, but I could see her confusion growing. Finally, she admitted the complaint had been oddly specific, claiming I was operating a substance lab in my kitchen and conducting ritual abuse. Allegations so outlandish, they seemed designed to be dismissed. She apologized for the intrusion and said she'd be closing the case as unfounded, but I asked her to document everything, especially the source of the complaint. After she left, I found another note slipped under my door. That was a warning. Stop now or the next visit won't be so pleasant. The threat was clear. Vincent could weaponize any system, make any accusation, force me to defend myself against lies while he continued operating with impunity. But he'd made a mistake with the CPS complaint. It was so obviously false, so maliciously fabricated, that it would help prove his pattern of harassment when we finally got to court. Every attack he made was becoming evidence against him. I gathered the evidence from the CPS visit and added it to my growing collection. The social worker's report would be crucial in demonstrating Vincent's harassment pattern. My daughter went to her room to finish homework while I reviewed my options. The isolation tactics were working. Vincent had effectively cut me off from legal help and scared away witnesses, but there had to be another way. My phone rang with an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Heavy breathing filled the line before a gravelly voice warned me to check my daughter's backpack. I ran to her room and found a small tracking device sewn into the lining, along with photos of her at various locations throughout the past week. My hands trembled as I removed the device and crushed it under my heel. They'd been tracking her every movement, building a detailed map of her daily routine. I decided to change tactics. If Vincent wanted to play dirty, I'd have to get creative. I called my brother-in-law, who worked in private security, and asked him to sweep my apartment for bugs. He arrived within an hour with electronic detection equipment. We found 3 listening devices, one in the kitchen, one in my bedroom, and one in the living room. He showed me how to disable them without making it obvious, leaving them in place but feeding them dead air. While he worked, I explained the situation. He offered to help protect my daughter, suggesting we vary her routes to school and have different family members pick her up each day. We created a schedule that would make it harder for Vincent's people to predict her movements. He also gave me a panic button that would alert him immediately if we were in danger. That night, I received another text with a photo of my elderly mother entering her apartment building across town. The message was clear. Vincent could reach anyone I cared about. I called my mother immediately, telling her to pack a bag and stay with my aunt for a few days. She protested but agreed when she heard the fear in my voice. I couldn't sleep, so I spent the night organizing my evidence into multiple categories: building code violations, financial fraud, witness intimidation, and now stalking and harassment. Each folder was meticulously labeled and cross-referenced. I created a timeline showing how Vincent's operation had evolved and expanded over the years. The pattern was clear. He targeted vulnerable communities, used fear to maintain control, and had his brother cover up any complaints. In the morning, I drove my daughter to school myself, taking a different route and watching for any vehicles following us. At the school, I spoke with the principal about the security concerns, showing her the photos Vincent's people had taken. She was alarmed and promised to increase supervision during recess and dismissal. I also gave her a photo of Vincent and his known associates to share with the security staff. On my way back, I noticed the same van from yesterday parked near my building. Instead of going home, I drove to a busy shopping center and parked in the underground garage. I waited 20 minutes, then slipped out through a service entrance and took public transportation to Carlos's neighborhood. I needed to convince him to help before Vincent silenced him too. Vincent's playing chess while everyone else is stuck on checkers, tracking devices in backpacks, bugs in apartments, even corrupted security footage. This guy's running a whole spy movie operation just to protect his slum empire from one determined mom with a smartphone. I found Carlos at a local diner, hunched over coffee and looking exhausted. He flinched when I sat down but didn't leave. I showed him the photos of my daughter and explained how Vincent was escalating. Carlos's jaw tightened as he looked at the images. He had a daughter the same age, he reminded me, and the thought of someone stalking her made him furious. Carlos finally agreed to help, but on his terms. He would provide information about the storage unit and Vincent's operations, but he wouldn't testify in court. He was too afraid of deportation and losing custody of his daughter. I accepted his conditions, grateful for any assistance. He drew me a map to the storage facility and gave me the unit number, warning that Vincent checked it regularly. We arranged to meet again in 2 days. Carlos would try to find out Vincent's schedule for visiting the storage unit. In the meantime, he'd document any illegal activities he witnessed at the properties. I gave him a burner phone to contact me safely and stressed the importance of being careful. Vincent had eyes everywhere, and we couldn't afford to tip him off. Back at my apartment, I found my door slightly ajar again. This time, nothing was missing, but everything had been moved slightly. Pictures were crooked, furniture shifted a few inches, drawers left partially open. It was psychological warfare, designed to make me feel violated and unsafe in my own home. I photographed everything before straightening up, adding it to my harassment file. The journalist called with an update. She'd been investigating Vincent's brother in the housing department and discovered a pattern of complaints disappearing whenever they involved Vincent's properties. She'd also found 3 other landlords running similar schemes, all connected to Vincent's network. The story was bigger than we'd realized, but she needed more concrete evidence before her editor would approve publication. I spent the afternoon reaching out to tenant advocacy groups, hoping to find others who'd dealt with Vincent. Most were reluctant to get involved, but one organizer named Nathy mentioned knowing several families who'd been displaced by Vincent's operations. She agreed to connect me with them if they were willing to talk. Every witness we could find strengthened our case. My daughter came home from school upset. Some kids had been asking her strange questions about where we lived and whether we were moving soon. The questions seemed innocent enough, but the timing was suspicious. I reassured her while making a mental note to investigate who these children's parents were. Vincent's reach into the school community was deeper than I'd thought. That evening, we had dinner at my sister's house for safety. While the kids played, I updated her on the situation. She was horrified by the escalation and offered to let us stay with her, but I knew that would only make us easier targets. We needed to maintain our routines while being vigilant. She agreed to be part of the school pickup rotation and to check on our apartment when we weren't there. On the drive home, I noticed we were being followed again. This time, it was a sedan, keeping 3 cars back, but matching our turns. I called my brother-in-law and described the vehicle. He advised me to drive to the nearest police station again, but I had a different idea. I drove to the busiest part of downtown, where traffic cameras covered every intersection. If Vincent's people wanted to follow me, they'd be recorded doing it. The sedan eventually peeled off, but I spent another hour driving randomly before heading home. My daughter had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the stress of recent days. I carried her inside, double-checking the locks and setting up a chair against the door as an additional alarm. The psychological toll was mounting, but I couldn't let Vincent win through intimidation. Late that night, Carlos texted from the burner phone. Vincent would be at the storage facility tomorrow afternoon, retrieving files for his lawyer. It was risky, but if I could get there first, I might be able to photograph the evidence before he removed it. I spent hours planning the approach, considering every possible complication. One mistake could blow everything. I woke before dawn and prepared carefully. I dressed in nondescript clothes and a baseball cap, taking public transportation to avoid being followed. The storage facility was in an industrial area, surrounded by warehouses and auto shops. I arrived 2 hours before Vincent's expected visit, giving myself time to scout the location and plan escape routes. The facility had minimal security, just a keypad entry and some cameras at the main entrance. I watched other customers come and go, noting the blind spots in camera coverage. Carlos's key worked perfectly, and I slipped inside, finding Unit 47B in the back corner. My hands shook as I opened the lock, knowing I was crossing a line that Vincent would never forgive. Inside, boxes of documents lined the walls, financial records, lease agreements, correspondence with contractors, all the evidence of Vincent's illegal empire. I photographed everything methodically, making sure each image was clear and readable. There were receipts for cash payments, contracts with shell companies, even a ledger showing the real occupancy of each building versus what was reported to the city. I found a folder marked insurance that made my blood run cold. Vincent had been taking out policies on his properties with inflated values, setting himself up to profit if any of them burned down. The implications were terrifying. Had the fire in our building been more than just an accident? I photographed every page, my mind racing with the possibilities. A noise outside made me freeze. Footsteps were approaching, and I could hear voices. I quickly closed the boxes and moved to the back of the unit, hiding behind a stack of furniture. The footsteps passed by, just other customers accessing their units, but my heart was pounding. I waited 5 minutes before emerging, making sure the coast was clear. I had just relocked the unit when my phone buzzed. Carlos was warning me that Vincent had left early and was already en route. I had maybe 10 minutes before he arrived. I walked quickly but calmly toward the exit, keeping my head down. As I reached the main gate, a familiar car pulled into the parking lot. Vincent was here. I ducked behind a dumpster, watching as Vincent and 2 other men got out of the car. They were talking animatedly, and Vincent looked agitated. He kept checking his phone and scanning the area. Had someone tipped him off? I waited until they entered the building, then sprinted to the nearest bus stop, not stopping until I was miles away. Back home, I immediately uploaded all the photos to multiple cloud services and sent copies to the journalist. The evidence was damning, showing years of systematic fraud and endangerment. But I knew Vincent would realize someone had been in his storage unit. The question was whether he'd suspect me or Carlos. Either way, things were about to escalate dramatically. Sure enough, within hours, I received a call from Carlos. Vincent was furious, interrogating all his employees about who might have accessed the storage unit. Carlos was playing dumb, but Vincent's paranoia was spiraling. He'd already changed the locks and was moving the documents to a new location. We'd gotten the evidence just in time. The journalist called, excited by what I'd sent. Her editor had approved the story, but they needed a few days to verify everything and consult with their legal team. She warned me to be extra careful in the meantime. Once the story broke, Vincent would know exactly who was behind it. I needed to be ready for his retaliation. I spent the evening making contingency plans. I arranged for my daughter to stay with different relatives each night, never sleeping in the same place twice. I packed emergency bags with clothes, cash, and copies of important documents. I even researched hotels in neighboring towns in case we needed to disappear for a few days. My phone rang with another unknown number. This time, it was a woman's voice, soft and hesitant. She introduced herself as Alexander, Vincent's former bookkeeper. She'd heard I was gathering evidence against him and wanted to help. She had records going back 5 years, showing the full scope of his financial crimes, but she was terrified of meeting in person. We arranged to communicate through encrypted messages. Alexander sent me spreadsheets showing Vincent's real income versus what he reported to the IRS. The tax evasion alone totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars. She also had emails between Vincent and his brother, explicitly discussing how to bury complaints and falsify inspection reports. It was the smoking gun we needed. The next morning brought a new threat. A letter arrived from Vincent's lawyer, not just threatening to sue, but claiming they had evidence I'd committed burglary and corporate espionage. They were demanding I cease all defamatory activities and return any stolen documents immediately. The letter was carefully worded to sound legitimate, while being vague about what exactly exactly they thought I'd done. I forwarded the letter to the journalist's legal team and tried to find a lawyer of my own. After a dozen calls, I finally found one willing to take the case pro bono. She was a young attorney named Victoria who specialized in tenant rights. She'd been following Vincent's case and was eager to help bring him down. We met at her office to strategize. Victoria reviewed all my evidence and was impressed by how thorough I'd been. She explained that Vincent's threats were mostly bluster, designed to intimidate me into backing down. The key was to stay on offense, not let him control the narrative. She began preparing a countersuit for harassment and defamation, turning Vincent's own tactics against him. Vincent's timing at the storage unit feels awfully precise for someone who was supposedly arriving later. Makes me wonder if Carlos was playing both sides this whole time. The way everything lined up so perfectly with those documents just sitting there, then Vincent showing up exactly when she's leaving. Something doesn't quite add up here. Meanwhile, the situation at my daughter's school was deteriorating. The construction next door had accelerated, with crews working late into the night. The noise was disrupting classes, and parents were starting to complain. I attended a school board meeting where several parents voiced concerns about the renovation, but the board claimed their hands were tied since all the permits were in order. After the meeting, I was approached by another parent who whispered that she'd overheard the construction foreman talking about installing efficiency units in the building. She didn't know what that meant, but I did. Vincent was planning to create another death trap right next to an elementary school. The thought of children playing yards away from another potential fire hazard made me physically ill. I shared this information with Nathy from the tenant advocacy group. She mobilized her network to investigate the construction site, documenting any safety violations or suspicious activities. Within days, they'd found multiple issues: improper electrical work, inadequate fire exits, and modifications that didn't match the approved permits. We had Vincent violating building codes in real time. The pressure was mounting on all sides. Carlos reported that Vincent had hired new security for all his properties, making it harder for tenants to come and go freely. Some families were essentially trapped, afraid to leave in case they couldn't get back in. The humanitarian crisis was worsening, but Vincent didn't care as long as the rent kept flowing. Then came the breakthrough we'd been waiting for. One of Vincent's other properties had a minor fire, just a kitchen accident, but it required fire department response. When they arrived, they found conditions similar to our building: overcrowding, blocked exits, and disabled smoke detectors. This time, they couldn't ignore it. The building was evacuated and condemned on the spot. The media picked up the story, and suddenly Vincent's empire was under scrutiny. Other tenants began coming forward, emboldened by the attention. The journalist's story was still days away from publication, but the groundwork was being laid. Public opinion was turning against Vincent, and his political connections were starting to distance themselves. Vincent's response was swift and vicious. I woke to find my car vandalized again, this time with paint stripper poured over the hood. My tires weren't just slashed, but completely shredded. A note was tucked under what remained of the windshield wiper: last warning. But I was past the point of being intimidated. Every attack just added to the evidence against him. Victoria filed an emergency restraining order, citing the escalating harassment and threats against my daughter. The judge granted it, ordering Vincent to stay away from us and cease all contact. It was a small victory, but I knew a piece of paper wouldn't stop someone as desperate as Vincent. Still, it was now on record that he was dangerous. The journalist called with final questions before the story went to print. She'd corroborated everything with multiple sources and had statements from dozens of affected tenants. The story would run in 2 days, exposing not just Vincent, but the entire network of corruption that enabled him. She warned me to be ready for the fallout and to have a safe place to stay when it hit. I spent those 2 days in a state of hypervigilance. My daughter stayed with my parents out of state, missing school but safe from Vincent's reach. I moved between friends' houses, never staying in one place too long. Carlos checked in regularly, reporting that Vincent was growing increasingly erratic, lashing out at employees and tenants alike. The night before the story was set to publish, I got one last call from Vincent himself. His voice was calm, almost resigned, as he made one final offer. He would drop all legal threats, leave me and my family alone, even pay for our relocation if I would just convince the journalist to call the story. The desperation beneath his composure was palpable. He knew his empire was crumbling. I recorded the call, adding it to my evidence collection. His offer was an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement that everything I documented was true. I told him it was too late, that too many people knew the truth now. He couldn't intimidate or buy his way out of this one. The silence on the other end stretched for long seconds before he hung up without another word. That night, I barely slept, knowing that everything was about to change. The story would expose Vincent's crimes to the world, but it would also make me a target for anyone still loyal to him. I'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. As dawn broke, I checked the news website obsessively, waiting for the story to appear. The morning the story went live, I was already at the district attorney's office with Victoria, presenting our complete evidence package. The prosecutor examined each document carefully, cross-referencing the financial records with the building violations. Vincent's insurance policies caught her attention immediately. She made several phone calls, and within an hour, investigators were dispatched to all of Vincent's properties simultaneously. I watched from across the street as police cars surrounded the building next to my daughter's school. The construction crews scattered, some trying to hide evidence of the illegal modifications they'd been making. Officers emerged carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment. Vincent arrived 20 minutes later, his face going pale when he saw the scene. He tried to leave, but found his path blocked by detectives who had warrants for his arrest. The journalist's story had gone viral within hours, picked up by local news outlets and shared thousands of times on social media. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from former tenants who'd suffered under Vincent's schemes. Many wanted to share their own stories, to add their voices to the growing chorus demanding justice. I forwarded their contacts to Victoria, who was building a comprehensive case. That afternoon, Carlos called from a payphone. Vincent's arrest had created chaos at the properties. The security guards had abandoned their posts, and tenants were finally free to come and go. But many had nowhere else to go, trapped by poverty and immigration status. Carlos was helping organize temporary shelters through through local churches while the city scrambled to address the humanitarian crisis Vincent had created. I picked up my daughter from my parents' house, explaining that the immediate danger had passed. She hugged me tightly, relieved to be coming home. On the drive back, we passed one of Vincent's buildings where families were loading their belongings into trucks, finally free to leave the dangerous conditions they'd endured for so long. My daughter watched quietly, understanding more than I'd given her credit for. Back at our apartment, I found a notice from the building's management company. With Vincent in custody, they were conducting emergency inspections of all units. The illegal modifications would be removed, the building brought up to code. They estimated 3 months of construction, during which they'd provide temporary housing for all legitimate tenants. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Victoria called with updates from the arraignment. Vincent had been charged with 47 counts, including racketeering, endangerment, tax evasion, and witness intimidation. His brother at the housing department had been suspended pending investigation. The judge set bail at $2 million, which Vincent couldn't make without liquidating properties that were now under scrutiny. He'd remain in custody until trial. The next few days blurred together in a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media attention. I gave statements to investigators, provided testimony to the grand jury, and worked with Victoria to ensure all our evidence was properly documented. Other tenants began coming forward, no longer afraid of deportation or retaliation. Maria, the young mother from the basement, testified about the conditions her children had endured. Alexander, Vincent's former bookkeeper, finally agreed to meet in person at Victoria's office. She brought additional evidence showing Vincent had been planning to expand his operation to other cities, using the profits from his current properties to fund more dangerous conversions. She'd quit when she realized the scope of his plans, but had kept copies of everything, knowing someday someone would need proof. The fire department's investigation revealed that the electrical fire in our building hadn't been accidental. The wiring had been so overloaded that failure was inevitable. It was only luck that it hadn't been worse, that no one had died. The insurance policies Vincent had taken out suddenly looked less like business planning and more like premeditation. Additional charges were filed. Carlos found legitimate work with a property management company that valued his honesty about Vincent's operations. He became a key witness, explaining the inner workings of the scheme to prosecutors. His testimony about the storage unit and Vincent's real books proved crucial in establishing the financial crimes. The district attorney's office helped him secure legal residency in exchange for his cooperation. 3 weeks after Vincent's arrest, I attended a community meeting at my daughter's school. Parents packed the auditorium, demanding answers about how the construction next door had been approved. The school board announced they were reviewing all nearby development applications and implementing new safety protocols. The building Vincent had purchased would be converted to affordable housing under strict oversight. Vincent's properties were placed under emergency management while the courts sorted out ownership. The city established a task force to inspect every unit and relocate tenants to safe housing. Vincent's criminal empire collapsing faster than his shoddy construction work is quite the sight. 47 charges means he'll need a storage unit just for his legal paperwork. It was a massive undertaking, but public pressure demanded action. News crews documented the conditions people had lived in, making it impossible for officials to look away any longer. My daughter returned to school with new confidence, no longer looking over her shoulder. Her teachers reported she was more engaged, more willing to participate. The constant stress of recent months had affected her more than I'd realized. We started seeing a family counselor to process everything that had happened, to rebuild our sense of security. Victoria filed civil suits on behalf of the tenants, seeking damages for the dangerous conditions they'd endured. Vincent's assets were frozen, his properties likely to be sold to compensate victims. It wouldn't undo the trauma, but it would provide some measure of justice. Many families would finally have the resources to start over in safe homes. The criminal trial was set for 6 months out, giving prosecutors time to build their case. Vincent's lawyer attempted various motions to dismiss, claiming evidence had been obtained illegally, but the judge rejected each one. The sheer volume of documentation, witness testimony, and physical evidence made Vincent's guilt undeniable. His empire had crumbled completely. I returned to work, trying to establish normal routines. Colleagues who'd followed the news treated me differently, some with admiration, others with wariness. Whistleblowers made people uncomfortable, even when they'd done the right thing. I focused on my job and my daughter, letting Victoria handle the ongoing legal matters. Vincent's brother was indicted on corruption charges after investigators found years of buried complaints and falsified reports. The housing department underwent a complete restructuring, with new oversight measures to prevent similar abuse. It was a small victory in a system that had failed so many people for so long. One evening, while helping my daughter with homework, she asked if we were really safe now. I told her that Vincent couldn't hurt us anymore, that the law had finally caught up with him. She nodded, then asked about all the other families who'd lived in those dangerous buildings. I explained that people were working to help them, that changes were being made. She seemed satisfied, returning to her math problems with renewed focus. The journalist won an award for her investigative reporting, bringing national attention to the issue of predatory landlords. She interviewed me for a follow-up piece about the importance of documenting evidence and standing up to intimidation. I agreed on the condition that the focus remain on the systemic problems, not on making me some kind of hero. As the trial date approached, Vincent attempted one last manipulation. Through his lawyer, he offered to plead guilty to lesser charges if I would agree not to testify. The desperation was obvious. My testimony would be devastating. I refused immediately. After everything he'd put us through, he deserved to face the full consequences of his actions. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. I reviewed my testimony one more time, making sure every detail was clear. My daughter made me a good luck card with a drawing of our apartment building, but this time with proper exits and working smoke detectors. Children noticed everything, processed trauma in their own ways. On the first day of trial, the courthouse was packed with former tenants, advocates, and media. Vincent sat at the defense table, no longer the confident predator who'd terrorized so many families. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without the power he'd wielded so cruelly. When our eyes met, I felt no satisfaction, just relief that this chapter was ended. ending. My testimony lasted 3 hours. I presented the evidence methodically, walking the jury through Vincent's schemes, the dangerous conditions, the intimidation tactics. The prosecutor displayed photos of the overcrowded rooms, the blocked exits, the disabled smoke detectors. Several jurors looked visibly shaken by what they saw. Other witnesses followed, each adding their piece to the puzzle. Maria described raising her children in a windowless basement. Carlos explained the cash payments and doctored books. Alexander detailed the financial fraud. The elderly couple who'd nearly died in the fire gave devastating testimony about being trapped in their room. Vincent's defense attorney could barely dent the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than a day, guilty on all counts. Vincent showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his hands trembled slightly. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, thanking the jury for their service. As court adjourned, former tenants embraced in the hallway, finally seeing justice served. At sentencing, victim impact statements filled an entire morning. Families described the fear, the degradation, the constant threat of eviction or deportation. Children talked about nightmares of fires, of being trapped. The judge listened intently, occasionally removing his glasses to wipe his eyes. When Vincent was offered the chance to speak, he remained silent. The sentence was harsh, but fair. 25 years in prison, millions in restitution, lifetime prohibition from property management. Vincent would spend decades behind bars, unable to exploit vulnerable families ever again. As guards led him away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. We'd won. My daughter was safe. The buildings would be fixed. In the weeks that followed, I helped other tenants navigate the restitution process, sharing what I'd learned about documentation and legal procedures. A non-profit organization formed to assist families affected by predatory landlords, using our case as a model. Real change was happening, slowly but surely. My daughter and I moved to a new apartment in a building with proper safety measures and honest management. She decorated her room with bright colors, finally feeling secure enough to make it truly hers. We established new routines, new traditions, free from the constant fear that had defined our lives for so long. Looking back, I sometimes wondered if I'd do it all again, knowing the cost. Then I'd remember the elderly couple trapped in that windowless room, the families crammed into fire traps, the children whose lives were at risk. There had been no choice. Someone had to stop Vincent, and circumstances had made that someone me. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from Maria. She'd found stable housing, and her children were thriving in their new school. She thanked me for standing up when others were too afraid, for giving her family a chance at a better life. I kept that letter, a reminder that ordinary people could make a difference when they refused to be silenced. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an experience. My daughter excelled in school, no longer burdened by constant fear. I advanced at work, my reputation for integrity actually helping my career. We built a good life, a safe life, exactly what every family deserved. The buildings Vincent had owned were renovated properly, turned into affordable housing with strict oversight. Families moved in, finally having homes that met basic safety standards. The illegal units were removed, proper exits installed, smoke detectors that actually worked. It was what should have existed all along. There's something really interesting about how Vincent stays silent when given the chance to speak at sentencing. Makes me wonder if he finally understands what he did, or if he's just given up on trying to manipulate people. 25 years seems like a lot, but then again, the way all those families describe their fear and the kids talking about nightmares of being trapped, that's pretty heavy stuff.